She arrived on a Tuesday, which is the worst day for anything to change your life. I know that sounds like the kind of thing a man says after the fact, once he's had time to sit with it and decide what he believes. But I wrote it down that Tuesday evening, right there in the margin of my ledger where I keep the tallies for feed costs and fence repairs and the small mathematics of a life that mostly makes sense. Tuesday, worst day. I don't know why I wrote it. I just knew. Her name was written on the paper my cousin Aldous had forwarded from the agency in St. Louis. Marta Vasquez, age 24, from the province of Sonora, Mexico, speaks serviceable English, experienced with livestock, willing to relocate. Aldous had arranged the whole thing on my behalf while I was laid up with a broken collarbone the previous winter, which tells you something about Aldous and something about me, both of which I am not entirely proud of. The stagecoach came in at 2:30. She was the last one off. She stood in the dust of the Sweetwater Wells depot with a single canvas bag and a bruise the color of a thunderhead along her left jawline, and she looked at me the way a person looks at a locked door, not with fear exactly, but with the careful arithmetic of someone calculating whether it was worth trying to pick the lock or better to find another door entirely. I am 6 feet and 4 inches tall. I weigh 260 pounds in my boots. I have been told my face looks like something that was assembled in a hurry from parts that didn't quite fit. None of that helped. She said in English that was careful and deliberate as stitchwork, "You are Mr. Calvin Holt." I said I was. She said, "I need to tell you something before we go further." And I said, "All right." And she said, "Please help me, something is wrong." That was the beginning. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, standing there in the Tuesday dust with my hat in my hands and my mouth doing nothing useful, was that something is wrong was the most precisely accurate thing anyone had ever said to me, and that before it was over I would have to decide what kind of man I actually was, as opposed to what kind of man I'd been comfortable imagining myself to be. This is what I wrote down afterward. This is as close as I can get to true. I am not a man given to fussing over details, which is why I keep the ledger. If I didn't write things down, they'd slide through me like water through creek gravel, present for a moment, then gone, leaving the ground only slightly damp and no accounting of where any of it went. My father was the same way. His father before him, too, probably, though I never knew that man well enough to say. There's something in the Holt line that makes us good at the large gestures, building fences, breaking horses, surviving hard winters, and poor at the small ones, the noticing, the remembering, the saying out loud of things that matter. So I kept the ledger, and I wrote things in the margins when I didn't know where else to put them. Tuesday, worst day. And then beneath that, she has a bruise. She was afraid before she got off the stage. I wrote that second part a half-mile outside of town, driving the buckboard north toward the ranch, with Marta Vasquez sitting beside me in silence so particular it had its own weight. She held her canvas bag in her lap with both hands, the way you hold something you're not sure will still be there if you let go. The land stretched out around us in every direction, high desert scrub going gold in the late afternoon light, the Guadalupe ridgeline purple and distant to the east, a hawk working a thermal overhead with that easy patience hawks have that I have always envied. I am not, as I said, good at the small things, but I noticed all of that. I noticed it because I was trying very hard not to stare at the bruise. "How long were you traveling?" I asked, which was not the question I wanted to ask. 11 days, she said. "From Hermosillo to Nogales by wagon, then the train to Tucson, then the stage to here." She paused. I did not sleep much. No, I imagine not. I shifted the reins to my left hand, wiped my right on my thigh. "There's a room prepared, off the kitchen. It's not much, but it's clean, and the window faces east, so you get the morning light." She turned to look at me then. Not a long look, a quick, assessing one like she was checking a measurement. "You prepared it yourself?" "Yes." "You live alone?" "Since my mother passed, 3 years ago." She looked back at the road. "I am sorry about your mother." "Thank you." Another silence, different from the first one, slightly less dense, like clouds thinning without quite breaking. I let it be. I have learned, slowly and at some cost, that silences should be let alone until they're ready to turn into something else. The bruise was on the left side of her jaw, fading at the edges toward yellow, which meant it was 3 or 4 days old. It was the kind of bruise that comes from a hand, not a fall. I had grown up on a ranch and I had seen both kinds, on horses and on people, and I knew the difference. The shape of it was particular. The shape of it made something go tight and quiet in my chest. We were almost to the ranch gate when she spoke again. At the agency, she said, there was a man who arranged the paperwork. I know Aldous Holt, my cousin. Yes, a pause that had something careful inside it. He told me the arrangement was for 1 year, and that after 1 year I could decide whether to remain or return to Mexico, and that there would be no, she searched for the word, obligation. Beyond the household work. I kept my eyes on the road. That's correct. He told me that on the first day. Another pause. On the second day, he told me something different. I pulled the buckboard to a stop. I don't know why exactly. We were still a quarter-mile from the gate, in the middle of nowhere, with the hawk still circling overhead and the light going copper along the tops of the scrub. But I stopped, and I turned to look at her, and I said, "What did he tell you on the second day?" She looked back at me without flinching. I noticed that, the not flinching. It cost her something. I could see that too, a slight tightening around her eyes, the kind of effort that looks like stillness but isn't. He told me that the arrangement was actually his arrangement, not yours. That you had agreed to take whatever the agency sent and ask no questions, and that he had, she stopped, then started again, more precisely, that he had certain expectations of his own, that I would be working for him as well, that there were debts involved, my family's debts, that he had paid them, and that I was, she said the next word like she was setting down something heavy, collateral. I did not say anything for a long time. The hawk banked and dropped below the ridge and was gone. Marta, I said. Her name felt strange in my mouth, too large for the moment, or maybe the moment was too large for anything. Aldous Holt does not own this ranch. He has no authority here, whatever he told you. I know, she said. I knew it the moment I saw you. You did not look like a man who had agreed to that. She looked down at her hands on the canvas bag. But I needed to tell you, before we went further, because if I was wrong about you, I needed to know now. The arithmetic of it hit me slowly, the way cold does from the outside in, taking its time. She had gone off that stagecoach not knowing whether I was the lock or the door, whether I was a man who would look at a woman with a bruise on her jaw and say Aldous told me about the debts, or whether I was something else. She had made the calculation and taken the risk and said, please help me to a stranger twice her size in a strange country, because the alternative was worse. I thought about what the alternative might have been. I thought about Aldous, whom I had known my whole life, whom I had trusted with this because my collarbone was broken and I was tired of eating my own bad cooking. I thought about the debts he'd mentioned to her and hadn't mentioned to me. I picked up the reins again. You'll stay, I said. The arrangement is what I agreed to. 1 year household work, your own room, no obligation beyond that. Aldous has no part in it. She was quiet for a moment, and his expectations. I'll handle Aldous. Another small silence. Then, you say that very calmly. I'm not calm, I said. I'm just slow. For the first time, and I would write this in the ledger that night, would circle it twice without quite knowing why, she almost smiled. Not fully. Just a slight easing at the corners of her mouth, like a door opening an inch to check the weather before deciding. Slow can be good, she said. Sometimes, I agreed, not always. We drove the rest of the way to the ranch in silence, but it was a third kind of silence now, different from both the ones before. I don't have a good word for it. Something like the quiet after a decision has been made and before its consequences have fully arrived. The ranch was called the Holt Cross, after the family name and the shape of the canyon it sat in. 2 arroyos crossing at a wide, flat spot where my grandfather had put the main house, the barn, the small bunkhouse where no one had slept in 4 years. 3,000 acres of high desert grazing land, decent water from the canyon spring, a small herd of 60 cattle and 8 horses. Not a grand operation, a sufficient one if you worked it right. I showed Marta to her room. It was small, 8 by 10, with a narrow bed, a washstand, a window that faced east as I'd said, and a hook on the back of the door for her things. I had put a small clay pot of desert flowers on the washstand, which I was now embarrassed about. She saw me looking at the flowers, and I looked at the window instead. It's clean, she said. Yes. The window is good. She set her canvas bag on the bed. I wake early. So do I. The stove will be going by 5. She nodded, moved to the washstand, looked at the flowers. Touched one petal with the tip of one finger. "Prickly poppy," she said. I didn't know the name. They were growing along the fence line. "They grow everywhere in Sonora." She was quiet a moment, hand near the flower but not quite touching it anymore. "My mother has them in her garden." I left her alone after that. I went out to the barn and checked on the horses, not because they needed checking, but because I needed something to do with my hands and my thoughts. My horse, a big blue roan named Consequence, pushed his nose against my chest the way he did when he wanted his ears rubbed, and I rubbed his ears and thought about Aldous. Aldous was 42 and lived in a house in Sweetwater Wells and had opinions about how things ought to be arranged. He was my mother's sister's son, which made him blood but not close blood, the kind of relation that comes to the funeral and has thoughts about the will. He had a small land speculation operation and a gift for presenting complicated arrangements in simple language. I had trusted him with the correspondence to the agency because he had offered, and I had been in pain and too tired to think clearly. I should have thought clearly. I rubbed Consequence's ears and thought about the bruise on Marta's jaw, and what Aldous might have considered himself entitled to during the 2 days she'd been in his custody in St. Louis before the journey west. I thought about this for a while, and then I stopped thinking about it because thinking about it was making me want to put my fist through the barn wall, which would only result in a broken hand and a hole in the barn wall, and none of that would help anyone. I wrote in the ledger instead. I wrote, "Aldous, family's debts paid by him, check the specifics, handle this carefully," and then I wrote, "She is braver than I would be." That last part surprised me when I looked at it on the page. I don't usually write things like that. I crossed it out, then uncrossed it because the crossing out felt like a lie, and I left it there in the margin where I could see it. She was brave, that was just a fact, and I had a habit of writing down facts. The first week was its own kind of careful. Marta learned the kitchen fast, faster than I would have expected, given that the stove had a particular mood and the well pump needed a specific technique, and the root cellar organized itself according to a logic that was purely my mother's and that I had never quite decoded. Marta decoded it in 2 days. By the third morning, she had reorganized 3 shelves in the cellar, and the kitchen ran better than it had in 3 years. She was up before I was most mornings. I would come down at 5 to find the stove already going and coffee already made and Marta at the table with some kind of mending in her hands. Shirts, mostly, though she had found a torn horse blanket in the barn, and that appeared on the third morning repaired so neatly you couldn't find the seam. She didn't talk much. Neither did I. We worked out a rhythm to the mornings. Coffee, the small accounting of the day's tasks, the separation into our respective work. That felt less like 2 strangers negotiating space, and more like something that had been practiced, like a piece of music where both players know their part without discussing it. She was good with the horses. That had been in the agency's letter, experienced with livestock, but I'd assumed it meant chickens and goats, the way most of the agency women meant. I was wrong. She moved around Consequence on the third morning without asking permission, just walked to his stall, spoke to him in Spanish for about 10 seconds, and had him eating out of her hand before I fully understood what I was watching. "He's been ill-handled at some point," she said, running her palm along his neck. "Someone used a harsh bit." "Before I had him," I said, "I don't know his whole history." "He's fine now. He just needed to know you weren't going to do the same." She looked at me with that measuring look she had. "How long have you had him?" 6 years. "And he's like this with you?" "Yes." "Good." She gave Consequence a final pat and walked out of the stall like she'd been doing it her whole life. I stood there a moment with Consequence nosing my elbow and thought, she does that with people too. That reading of old hurt, that assessment of whether the handling had been fair. I went and checked on the cattle. I wrote in the ledger she sees things. On the 8th day, Aldous came. I had been expecting him. I had, in fact, been preparing for him, not in any dramatic way, not in the way a man prepares for a fight, but in the way you prepare for weather. You check the roof, and you bring in the firewood, and you make sure the shutters are solid, and then you wait. He rode in on a gray mare just after midday. Marta was in the kitchen. I was at the fence line restringing a section that had gone slack, and I saw him coming a quarter-mile off, and I set down my tools and walked to the gate to meet him. Aldous Holt was a compact man, 5'9", with a neat mustache and the kind of easy smile that does most of its work before the words begin. He swung down from the gray with the practiced ease of a man who does everything practiced and easy. "Calvin," he said. "She arrive all right." "She arrived," I said. He caught something in my tone. Aldous was good at that, at the quick catch, and his smile shifted half a degree towards something more careful. "Good, good. She's a capable-looking woman. I think you'll be pleased." "I need you to tell me about the debts," I said. The smile went fully careful now. "The debts." "Her family's debts, the ones you paid. She told me you used them to create an arrangement separate from the one I agreed to." I looked at him steadily. I have found that looking at people steadily is most of what you need to do in these situations. The words almost take care of themselves. "I want to understand what you believed you were purchasing." Aldous was quiet for a moment. In the quiet I could hear the wind through the scrub and the sound of my own blood moving, which is a sound I only hear when I am very still or very angry, and I was both. "Calvin," he said, "this is a business arrangement. The agency places women, the men pay a fee. There are sometimes additional considerations." "She has a bruise on her jaw," I said. He stopped. 3 or 4 days old when she arrived," I said. "Which means it was from before the stage, while she was in St. Louis, while she was in your care between the agency and the departure." "Women travel hard," Aldous said. "Things happen on." "Aldous," I said his name the way I say offenses down. A statement of fact, no heat in it, because heat would make it about something other than the fence. "I'm going to tell you this once, and I need you to hear it. Whatever you believed you'd arranged, it isn't arranged. She is here under the terms I agreed to, nothing more. Whatever debts her family owes you, that is a separate matter between you and them, and it has no bearing on anything that happens on this ranch. Are we clear?" He looked at me. He had known me 30-some years, which is a long time to know a man, and I think he was doing the calculation, whether I was bluffing, whether there was room to negotiate, whether the smile would find any purchase if he deployed it again. "Calvin," he said more quietly, "these are complicated matters. The girl's father owes nearly $300. I have paperwork." "Send me the paperwork," I said. "Whatever he owes you, I'll pay it. Put it against the ranch account." It would put me tight for the season. I didn't care. "After that, the debt is clear and you have no claim on her or her family. That's the end of the arrangement." Aldous was quiet a long moment. The gray mare shook her head, rattled her bit. "You're serious," he said. "Aldous," I said, "I am always serious. You've known me long enough to know that." He looked at me another moment, and then something in his face made a small, quiet adjustment like a house settling. Not defeat exactly, more like a man revising a map. "All right," he said. "I'll send the paperwork." "Thank you," I said. He mounted the gray and turned her toward the road. At the gate he stopped. "She's not what you think she is," he said without turning around. "There are things about her situation you don't know yet." "There are things about most situations I don't know yet," I said. "That's generally how situations work." He rode off. I stood at the gate and watched him go, and when he was out of sight, I turned and walked back to the fence and picked up my tools and went back to the stringing. What I didn't write down, because I didn't yet know how to put it into words, was the particular uncomfortable feeling that had settled into me somewhere during that conversation. Not quite guilt, not quite dread. Something more specific than either. The feeling of a man who has just taken a first step in a direction he can't yet see the end of, and who isn't entirely sure whether that's courage or foolishness and suspects it might be both. The thing about living alone for a long time is that you stop noticing the shape of your own days. I had been alone on the Holt Cross for 3 years. Before that, my mother. Before my mother's final decline, something that looked enough like a normal life that I'd stopped questioning it. But 3 years of solitude will rearrange a person without their noticing, will make their habits rigid, and their silences permanent, and their small eccentricities into something they mistake for character. I noticed the shape of my days after Marta had been on the ranch for 2 weeks. Noticed it because she was showing it to me without meaning to. The way a lamp will reveal the dimensions of a room it's moved into, not by describing them, but just by being light. She was up before 5. I had thought I was the early one. I was not. She had coffee going, and whatever grain she decided to soak for the morning's bread already soaking, and a mental list organized that I could see her working through, methodically, without hurry. She made lists the way I kept the ledger, as a way of imposing order on the parts of the day that were otherwise inclined to disorder. She also, I noticed, spoke to herself in Spanish while she worked. Low, continuous like a current under the surface. Not quite conversation, not quite prayer, something between. I asked her about it on the 14th morning, which was the first morning I felt like I could ask. She looked up from the bread dough with flour on her wrist and considered the question seriously, which was a thing I was learning about her. She considered questions seriously, even small ones, as if she believed that questions deserved the same respect as the things they asked about. "I'm keeping track," she said finally. "Of what?" "Of what I've done, what I need to do, sometimes the things I'm thinking about." She pressed the dough. "In Sonora, my mother did it too. She said it was like carrying a second mind outside your body so it didn't get too full." I thought about this. "I do that with the ledger," I said. She looked at me. "Yes," she said, "I noticed." I poured more coffee. "What are you thinking about right now, if you don't mind?" She was quiet a moment, turning the dough. "I am thinking about the letter I need to write to my father. I have not written since I arrived." Another pause. "I am not sure what to tell him." "About the debts?" I asked. "About the debts." She pushed the dough into the pan. "He doesn't know I know. He told me I was coming here for a good opportunity, a household position, that Senor Aldous had been generous. He didn't tell me." She stopped, set the pan aside, wiped her hands on the cloth. "He is a proud man. He thought he was helping me." The particular weight of that settled into the kitchen, and neither of us spoke for a bit. "I'm covering the debt," I said. "Whatever Aldous paid, I'm paying him back. Your father's account will be clear." She turned from the counter. The measuring look again, but different this time, not the door or lock calculation, but something more complicated, something with more layers to it. "Why?" she said. "Because it's the right thing to do." "That's not an explanation," she said. "That's a position." She said it without accusation, just precision. "Why is it the right thing to do for you now when you don't know my father and you didn't create the debt?" I opened my mouth and then closed it. I looked at my coffee. "Because Aldous is my family," I said slowly, "and whatever he did it using my name. He went to that agency as Calvin Holt's cousin." Whatever she agreed to thinking she was coming to a man I'd described, because Aldous was the one doing the describing. That makes it, I stopped, adjacent to my responsibility. She looked at me for a long moment. Outside, one of the horses, not consequence, one of the working mares, made a sound in the barn, and then it was quiet again. "That is an explanation," she said. "I'm slow," I said, "but I get there." The almost smile again, slightly more than before, a fraction more door, a fraction less locked. "Yes," she said, "I noticed that too." Aldous' paperwork arrived on a Wednesday. 3 pages in his neat, commercial hand, detailing a loan he'd extended to a man named Rodrigo Vasquez of Hermosillo, Sonora, in the amount of $280, against which Marta's arrangement had been secured. The language was careful and legal-looking and repellent, the way a trap is repellent when you understand what it was built to catch. I read it twice, then I showed it to Marta. She read it without expression, which I had come to understand was not the same as feeling nothing. She read the way she made lists, carefully, covering the ground, not skipping any of it. "He wrote my name," she said when she reached the bottom, "as collateral." "Yes." "He had my name in a contract before I agreed to anything." "Yes." She set the papers down on the table, put her hands flat on them. "My father signed this." "Yes." A silence, not the settling kind, a difficult one with a different weight. "He didn't understand what he was signing," she said, not defensively, just as a thing she believed. "He doesn't read well in English, and Aldous would have told him it was a standard loan document. He would have believed him." She looked up. "My father is a man who believes people when they seem trustworthy. He has been fooled before. He will be fooled again. It is not a flaw in him. It is just what he is." I wrote a check from the ranch account that afternoon. $280 made out to Aldous Holt. I sent it with a brief letter, debt discharged. No further claims on the Vasquez family or Marta Vasquez specifically. "Please confirm in writing." 3 sentences. It said what it needed to say. I would be tight through fall. I had already decided I didn't care, but I sat with the ledger that evening and looked at the numbers anyway, because looking at the numbers honestly was a discipline I believed in. The hay purchase would have to wait a month. The Fensoir order would have to be reduced. Some things I'd planned to do to the main house roof before winter would not get done. These were manageable inconveniences. I wrote them in the appropriate columns. What I didn't write, because there was no appropriate column for it. I had spent $280 on the good opinion of a woman I had known for 2 weeks and who was not obligated to have one. Which was not a reason. Which was not even a consideration that should enter a man's financial planning. I knew that. I wrote the numbers in the appropriate columns and went to bed. 3 days after I sent the check, Marta told me about Sonora. Not all of it at once. It came out in pieces over several evenings, after the dishes were done and the day's work was tallied, and there was nothing left to do but sit with the last of the light on the porch. I had a habit of sitting on the porch after dinner with the ledger and my pencil, ostensibly working but mostly just watching the light change on the Guadalupe ridgeline. She started sitting there too, on the other end of the bench, with whatever mending or sewing she had in hand. The first evening she told me about the land. Her family had ranched in Sonora for 3 generations, cattle country, drier than this, with different grass and different sky, but the same essential requirements of patience and hard work and willingness to lose things to weather or fever or the cruelties that land can visit on people who have tied their lives to it. The second evening she told me about the drought. 3 years of it, successive, the kind that doesn't just dry the ground but dries the savings and the credit and the hope. The herd had gone from 60 to 12 over 2 years of selling off what they couldn't feed. The third evening she stopped the mending in her hands and said, without preamble, "My father owed Aldous the money before I was born." I looked at her. "Before you were born?" "My grandfather borrowed from Aldis's father. When my grandfather died, my father inherited the debt. Aldous renewed it when he came through Hermosillo 2 years ago." She resumed the mending, one careful stitch. "He is good at finding people who owe the original debt and don't know that debts like that can be contested. My father didn't know." I sat with that. "How did Aldous know about your father's debt to his father?" "He kept records," she said. "Very good records. He told me this himself while he was explaining the arrangement. He seemed proud of the records." I thought about Aldous and his neat, commercial hand, and his 3 pages of careful documentation. I thought about how much effort goes into the construction of a system designed to catch people when they're desperate, how much patience it requires, how much you have to believe the catching is something other than what it is. "Marta," I said, "why did you come? Not why your father sent you, why did you agree?" She was quiet for a while. The light on the ridgeline went from copper to rose to the deep blue of early dusk. "Because he was going to lose the land," she said finally. "If I didn't come, he was going to sell the remaining cattle to pay the debt, and without the cattle there's no income, and without income he loses the land in 2 years, maybe 3. The land has been in our family for 70 years. A pause. "I am 24 years old. I can make the trip." "My father cannot, my mother cannot." She folded the mending in her lap. "It seemed simple when I decided, less simple after." "Less simple how?" She looked at me. In the blue evening light the bruise was almost invisible now, faded to something that would be gone in another week. "Aldous was not what I expected, and I didn't know if you would be better or the same." "And now," I said. She considered this with her usual seriousness. "Better," she said. "Different than better, actually. Better implies I was comparing you to something. You are not comparable to something." I didn't know what to do with that, so I wrote it down later in the ledger. Verbatim, in a column of its own. The Apache came on a Saturday, which I also noted in the ledger, though for different reasons than Tuesday. There were 3 of them, 2 men and a woman, at the eastern fence line just after sunrise. I saw them from the barn when I went out to feed, and I stood very still for a moment, the feed bucket in my hand, doing the slow inventory that the situation seemed to require. I had had encounters with Apache before, not many and not close. We were in the territory where the official posture was caution and the unofficial one was fear, and most ranchers maintained both. I maintained the official one and tried not to give the unofficial one too much room, because I had found that fear, when given too much room, has a habit of making worse decisions than careful attention does. These 3 were not moving like people planning violence. They were moving like people who were very tired, and who had a specific purpose they were pursuing despite the tiredness. I set down the feed bucket and walked to the fence. The older of the 2 men, I put him at 50, though I knew Apache faces didn't age quite the way I expected them to, and he might have been younger, watched me come without expression. The younger man was watching the ridgeline with the kind of attention that had nothing to do with the view. The woman was on her knees. I realized, getting closer, that the woman was on her knees because she couldn't stand. She was holding her left arm against her body, and the arm was wrong. The angle of it was wrong in the way that means broken, not badly set, not the kind that heals easy. I stopped at the fence. "She's hurt," I said. The older man looked at me. His English, when it came, was measured and exact, the English of a person who has learned it as a tool rather than a language. "We need water and a place to stop," he said. "We have been traveling." "Where are you going?" He looked at me for a moment, calculating the same things Marta had calculated at the stage depot. The quality of the locked door, the odds of another one. "South," he said, "to Mexico." I looked at the woman on her knees. I looked at the younger man who had stopped watching the ridgeline and was now watching me with an expression I didn't have a word for. I looked at the older man. "The arm needs setting," I said. "We know," he said. "I've done it before, on horses and once on a man." "I'm not a doctor." "Nor are we," he said. I unlatched the fence gate. "Come to the barn," I said. "We'll get water and I'll look at the arm." I was 41 years old, and I had thought I knew the shape of my life. The ledger said so. 600 and some pages, 12 years of daily entries, the mathematics of feed and fence and weather and small repairs, all of it adding up to something I had been comfortable calling a life. Not a remarkable one, a sufficient one, the kind that fits inside its own edges without spilling. The Apache woman's name, I learned later, was something that the older man translated, with a slight adjustment he didn't explain, as she who marks the path. I wrote it down as that in the ledger and let it be. Her arm was broken mid-forearm, a clean break, the kind that comes from a fall onto an outstretched hand rather than from a blow. She had been traveling on it for 2 days. I knew how to set a forearm break because my father had taught me, and my father had learned from a Navajo man he'd hired one summer who'd had the opinion, unusual for the time and place, that the ability to set a bone was something a working man should have, like the ability to read a weather sky or birth a calf. I was grateful, setting Marta's clean, folded dish towels into a bandage roll and asking her, without discussion, which she moved into without asking why, to hold the woman's shoulder while I worked. I was grateful for that Navajo man whose name I didn't know and never would. It wasn't pleasant. It wasn't quick. The woman made no sound during the setting, which impressed me deeply and disturbed me a little, because not making sound during that requires a quality of will I am not sure I have. Marta held her shoulder steady and spoke to her in Spanish, low and continuous, the same way she spoke to herself while she worked. Afterward, the woman slept in the barn. The 2 men took water and food. Marta had produced a remarkable quantity of food from the kitchen in a very short time, tortillas and dried meat and a cold pot of beans, and sat with her. The older man, whose name translated roughly to something the ledger called Walker Long Distance, came to find me at the fence line in the late afternoon. I was patching the section I'd been working on when Aldous came, working methodically in the way that kept my hands busy and my thinking clear. "You did not have to do this," he said. "No," I agreed. "I did, though." He looked at the fence, and then at the ranch, and then at me. I had learned in the course of the day that he was a man who looked at things honestly and in order, which gave him something in common with the ledger. "Why?" he said. It was the same question Marta had asked me about the debt. I thought about that. "Her arm needed setting," I said. "That's the beginning of the why. The rest of it," I paused, looking for the right words in the way you look for a tool you've misplaced, knowing it's somewhere in the barn. "I grew up on this land. My grandfather settled here and my father worked it, and I've worked it. The Apache were here before my grandfather, before his grandfather, before any of the lines we've drawn through this country. I'm not wise enough to have a position on all of that, but I know that a woman with a broken arm traveling south hasn't done anything to me, and helping her costs me a dish towel and some beans." Walker Long Distance was quiet for a moment. "You are not like most," he said. "I'm not sure what most I'm being compared to," I said. He almost smiled. It was, I noted, the same motion as Marta's almost smile, a door opening an inch to check the weather. I filed this observation away without knowing what to do with it. "The men who live on this land," he said. "Most look at us and see something to solve." I'm a rancher, I said. I solve fences and cattle and weather. People are not in that category. We stood at the fence line for a while without speaking. The Guadalupe ridgeline was going from the afternoon gold to the early evening purple, moving through its daily transformation with the serene disregard it had for everyone watching it. "Where are you going?" I asked again, truly. He was quiet for a moment. "There is a family group further south. We were coming from the north. There was," he paused, choosing, "difficulty in the north. We are going to the family." I didn't ask about the difficulty. It wasn't my question to ask. "You're safe here tonight," I said, "and tomorrow if you need it." "One night," he said. "We should move." He looked at me. "The young man, my son, he is concerned about your situation." "My situation?" "The woman you have at the ranch." He said this carefully, without judgment, as a fact being reported. "He says she is not comfortable, that she watches the road." I thought about this. "She's watching for something specific," I said. "I think it will pass." Walker long distance nodded slowly. "He has a way of reading people," he said. "He is usually right." "So does she," I said. He looked at me again, and this time there was something in the look I could read clearly. Curiosity. The genuine kind without agenda. "You are a strange man, Calvin Holt," he said. "I've been told," I said. "Usually not as a compliment." "I mean it as one," he said, and went back to the barn. I told Marta about the conversation that evening on the porch. She listened to the whole thing, the son's observation, the watching of the road, all of it, without speaking. When I finished, she set down her mending and folded her hands in her lap. "He's right," she said. "About what?" "About the road." She looked at the road, which was visible for a quarter-mile before the scrub closed over it, a pale line in the early dark. "I've been watching it since Aldous came. I thought—" She stopped. "I thought he might come back with someone, with something more formal than a conversation." I considered this. "He might," I said. "He's a man who doesn't give up arrangements easily." "Yes," she picked up the mending again, but didn't resume working. "Calvin, what happens after the year is finished?" It was the first time she'd used my name. I noted this without knowing what to do with it. "You decide," I said. "That was the agreement. After a year you decide whether to stay or go back." "And if I stay?" "Then we renegotiate. A different arrangement. A permanent one if that's what works." I shifted on the bench. "And if you go back, if you want to go back, I'll buy you the stage ticket and write you a reference that will get you good work wherever you need it." She was quiet a long time. The stars came out over the ridgeline, first one and then a scatter, and then the full spread of them, the way they do in desert country where the sky goes all the way to the ground. "You do not want me to go back," she said. It wasn't a question. I thought about denying it and then thought about the ledger and decided against it. "No," I said. "Why not?" "Because the ranch runs better," I said. "Because you reorganized the cellar in a way I've been meaning to do for 3 years. Because Consequence trusts you and he is not easy to trust. Because the bread is significantly better." She looked at me, I looked at the ridgeline. "That is a very careful answer," she said. "I told you," I said. "I'm slow. I get there, but I'm slow." She looked at the stars. I looked at the stars. The horses were quiet in the barn. From somewhere in the brush, a nighthawk made its sound, that particular descending call that sounds like a question with no answer planned. "There is something else I need to tell you," she said. "All right." She took a breath, set the mending on the bench between us. "The reason my father was in debt to Aldous' father in the first place, it was not a simple loan. My grandfather, when he borrowed, put up a piece of land as security, 40 acres on the northern edge of our range. It's in Aldous' documents. The land, technically," she stopped. "Technically, according to the document, it passed to Aldous' father when the original loan was not repaid in full. Which means Aldous may have a legal claim to that 40 acres. I was quiet. "That is what he meant," she said. "When he said there were things about my situation you didn't know yet, he wasn't talking about me. He was talking about the land." I sat with this. The land component changed the shape of things considerably. $280 was one thing. 40 acres of Sonoran Ranch land was something else, worth more than the money, worth more than most things. "He'll use it," I said, "sooner or later, if not to claim the land, then to threaten to claim the land to create leverage." "Yes," she said. What does your father know about this piece of land? Very little. My grandfather didn't speak about it. She folded her hands. I found the document in my grandfather's papers when I was 15. I never told my father because he would have worried and there was nothing to do about it. A pause. I have thought about it many times since. I thought about Walker Long Distance's son, who had a way of reading people, who had said Marta was watching the road. She wasn't just watching for Aldous to come back with a sheriff or a threat. She was watching because she was holding a secret the size of 40 acres and not knowing when it would come through the scrub toward her. "Can I see the document?" I asked. She looked at me. "You cannot fix this with a check," she said. It wasn't unkind, it was precise. "I know," I said, "but I'd like to understand the shape of it before I think about what can be done." She nodded. "Tomorrow," she said. "I'll show you tomorrow." We sat on the porch until the cold came down from the ridgeline and made the sitting uncomfortable, and then we went inside separately and went to bed, and I lay in the dark for a long time thinking about the shape of things. I wrote in the ledger 40 acres. Land claim. Aldous has a document. This is larger than I understood. And then after a space, she has been carrying this for 9 years, since she was 15, without telling anyone. And then after another space in the margin, I would not have managed that. The Apache left before dawn. I heard them go, not the sound of them exactly, but the particular quality of stillness that follows departure, the way a room feels after everyone has left it. I got up and dressed and went out to the barn. The stall where the woman had slept was clean. They had folded the blanket and left it in a careful square, and there was something on top of it that hadn't been there before. It was a small piece of worked leather, cut in a shape I didn't recognize, with a pattern pressed into it in a design I also didn't recognize. I picked it up carefully and turned it over. On the back, in charcoal, were 3 marks, not letters, not numbers, something else, something with its own grammar. I didn't know what they meant. I put the leather piece in my jacket pocket and went to feed the horses. When Marta came out with the morning coffee, she had taken to bringing 2 cups to the barn during morning feeding, which had become one of the fixed points of the day. She saw the piece in my hand and looked at it without touching. "What is it?" she asked. "I don't know," I said. "They left it." She looked at it a while. "The marks on the back," she said slowly. "I think in some of the border communities there are signs like this, trading signs or road signs. I don't know the specific meaning." "Neither do I said. "I'm going to keep it anyway." She handed me the coffee. "Why?" "Because they left it," I said. "Because that means it was meant to be here. Even if I don't understand what it says, it was meant to be here, and it feels like—" I stopped. "It feels like something I should account for." She looked at me with the measuring look. But it was different again this morning, not the door assessment, not the complicated multi-layer look of the conversation about her father. Something else. Something I didn't have a word for and didn't rush to find one. "The document is in my bag," she said, "about the land." "After feeding," I said. "After feeding," she agreed. The document was 40 years old and written in both English and Spanish, side by side in 2 columns, which suggested someone had taken some trouble to make sure both parties understood what they were agreeing to. Whether both parties had understood was a separate question. I read it twice. Then I read the English column aloud slowly, not to Marta, she already knew it, but to myself, because reading things aloud helped me understand their actual shape rather than the shape I was assuming they had. The security clause was real and it was clear. 40 acres, northern section, described by specific boundary markers that may or may not still exist. The loan amount. The terms. The assignment of the property interest to the Holt family if the loan was not repaid within 5 years of the signing date, which had passed 40 years ago. The document was never filed with any court, Marta said. My grandfather was not willing to do that. Neither was Aldis's father because the arrangement was not entirely legal under Mexican land law. It was a private agreement, which makes it enforceable between the parties, I said, but difficult to pursue through official channels. Yes, she looked at the document. Aldis knows this. He has the original filed in his own records. He could present it as a claim at any point, or he could use the threat of presenting it to pressure my father. I set the document on the table, thought. He's been holding it for years, I said. He could have used it at any point and didn't. He came at it sideways, the new loan, the arrangement, you as the instrument of collection. He prefers leverage to direct confrontation. Yes, she said, that is my reading of him also. Which means the document is most useful to him as a threat. Once he uses it as an actual claim, it becomes uncertain. Courts, lawyers, the question of Mexican land law and American land law and which one applies. He likes certainty. She was looking at me. You are thinking about how to take the uncertainty away from him, she said. I'm thinking about how to make the threat not worth making, I said. She was quiet for a moment. How? I thought about Walker long distance, and the way he'd looked at the fence line, and the ranch and me in order, as if taking an honest inventory. I thought about his son watching the ridgeline and then watching me. I thought about Marta at 15, finding a document in her grandfather's papers, and understanding what it meant and putting it back and saying nothing, carrying it forward into a life that would eventually require her to travel 11 days on a broken arrangement to a stranger twice her size in a strange country. I thought about what kind of man I was, versus what kind I'd been comfortable imagining myself to be. I think, I said slowly, that I'm going to write to a lawyer in Tucson, and I think we should also write to your father together if you're willing and tell him the whole shape of the situation, not to protect him from it, to give him the chance to know what he's been holding without knowing. I looked at her. He should understand what his daughter did for 70 acres of his land. Her chin moved, a small motion, the kind that means something is happening that can't quite be stopped. 40, she said, 40 acres. 40, I said, I'm sorry. She pressed her lips together, took a breath. He will feel terrible, she said. Yes, I said, he should feel terrible for a while, and then he should feel that his daughter is the most competent person he knows. I paused, because she is from where I'm standing. The almost smile was more than almost this time. It was present, brief but present, with something real behind it. You are getting faster, she said. A little, I said. Don't push it. I wrote Aldous a second letter the following week, after the Tucson lawyer had written back with his initial assessment. The letter to Aldous was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph summarized what I knew and what the lawyer had assessed regarding the document's enforceability. The second paragraph noted that the original loan, Aldous's father's loan, had been extended under conditions that appeared to violate Mexican land law at the time of signing, a point the lawyer had identified, which would make any formal claim uncertain and expensive to pursue. The third paragraph said, I would like to propose a final settlement. I will pay you an additional $200 against the document in exchange for a release of all claims signed and witnessed. After which the matter is closed and we need not interact further. Marta Vasquez and her family are not available as instruments of your financial arrangements. I think we understand each other. I sent it with the morning stage. Then I went to the barn and told Consequence about it, because Consequence had a way of listening that most people didn't. He pushed his nose against my chest. I rubbed his ears. I know, I said, it might not work. He snorted. Yes, I said, I know. Aldous's reply came on the following Tuesday. It was a single page, shorter than anything he'd ever written me. The handwriting was his usual neat commercial script, but the lines were slightly closer together than normal, which was the only sign that the letter had cost him something to write. He accepted the settlement. $200 the document released, all claims abandoned. He did not write anything beyond the legal minimum. I put the letter in the ledger. That evening on the porch, I told Marta. She listened without expression, in the way she listened to things that were large, full attention, no reaction yet, letting the information settle into its proper place before responding. Then she said, thank you. 2 words, simple. The most direct thing she'd said to me in the month and a half she'd been on the Holt Cross. I had been getting more words as the weeks passed. The stories from Sonora, the conversations about the land, the careful, detailed commentary on the seller reorganization. But they had all been built around the edges of something she was holding back. The thank you was not built around the edges. It was the thing itself. You don't have to thank me, I said. I know, she said. I want to. We sat with the last of the light on the ridgeline. The nighthawk made its question sound somewhere in the scrub. The leather piece from the Apache camp was on the porch railing where I'd taken to keeping it, and the last of the sun caught the pressed pattern on it and threw a small shadow. What are you going to tell your father? I asked. The truth, she said. All of it, you were right. He should know. A pause. I'll write it in Spanish and ask you to have someone check the English translation before I send the copy to the lawyer, if that's all right. It's all right, I said. I am going to stay, she said. If the offer is still, if you still. It's still, I said. She nodded, not the almost smile. Something else, something that looked like a person who has been holding their breath for a long time and has decided finally to stop. I looked at the ledger in my lap. I turned to a fresh page. Marta is staying, I wrote. The settlement is done. The debt is clear. Aldous has been handled. I stopped, looked at the ridgeline. Thought about Walker long distance, and the leather piece, and the marks on the back that I still didn't understand, but had taken to thinking of as a notation in a ledger I didn't know how to read yet. I wrote, the shape of this is different than I expected. I don't know what to call it. And then, in the margin, which was where I put the things I didn't know which column to give them, but I think I want to find out. I closed the ledger, and we sat in the dark until the cold came, and there was nothing left to do but go inside. The nighthawk made it sound one more time, and then it was quiet. I did not write down what happened next, because some things belong in the margins and some things don't belong in the ledger at all.